So today we are covering what's been happening at the UN's highest tribunal, the International Court of Justice, this week, as Myanmar defends itself against accusations of genocide. Today we're going to go to The Hague, where Aung San Suu Kyi, the once revered defender of human rights and democracy in Myanmar, is answering for the actions of Myanmar's military against the Rohingya. This is a case that was brought to the ICJ by the Gambia, and Aung San Suu Kyi's presence at the court has brought the plight of the Rohingya back into the international spotlight. So on this episode, a refresher on the Rohingya refugee crisis, Aung San Suu Kyi's defense, and what's at stake at this hearing. My guest is Fareed Khan, the Director of Advocacy and Media Relations for the Rohingya Human Rights Network. From Global News, I'm Tamara Kandakar, and you're listening to Wait, There's More. So Fareed, before we talk about the ICJ this week, can we start with a bit of background for listeners about the Rohingya and who they are?
The Rohingya are an ethnic minority in Myanmar, formerly Burma. They have been there for centuries, predating British colonial times. So this claim that they are recent arrivals that have snuck in across the border, over the last, 50, 60, 70 years just doesn't hold up weight. They are primarily Muslim, of the Muslim faith, although not all of them are Muslim. There are Hindu Rohingya as well. And physically, they are different in appearance from the Burmese majority ethnic group, which look more Chinese or Vietnamese in physical appearance. So there's a clear, visible distinction between what the Rohingya look like and what the majority Burmese look like.
Brown-skinned, right?
Yeah, they're brown. They're brown-skinned. If you look at, basically they look Indian.
And what's the population of the Rohingya?
The number is up counting them, but the estimates are there's between 500,000 to 600,000 Rohingya still remaining in Myanmar.
Yeah.
Over 80% of the Rohingya population lives in the diaspora, the largest majority of them living in countries around the Indian Ocean.
I think most people would have heard about the plight of the Rohingya in 2017 when the Burmese military moved in.
During a visit to an unclaimed strip of territory between Bangladesh and Myanmar, dubbed no man's land, several tearful women and girls threw themselves at UN members as they arrived. Close to 700,000 Rohingya have been forced to flee their homes as the Myanmar government launched what it called a crackdown over Rohingya insurgent attacks on security posts. However, many countries view the violent crackdown as an equivalent to ethnic cleansing. The military there accused of killings, rapes, and arson in order to push the Rohingya people out of the country.
But can you talk about the tensions between the Buddhist majority and the Rohingya population historically? The
historical animosity can be traced back to World War II. During World War II, Burma, which was a colony of the British at the time, was occupied by the Japanese. And in the war, the British promised the Rohingya and other minority groups, the Shan, the Kachin Karen, but the Rohingya specifically, that if they sided with the British against the Japanese, that they would give them their independence. So the Rohingya sided with the British, but the majority Burmese population sided with the Japanese. However, after World War II, when Burma did get its independence, one of the things that they did was to say that all the ethnic groups and all the minority groups that are situated within the physical borders of Burma are part of the Burmese nation. So the Rohingya were considered Burmese by their fathers of independence, basically. They were part of mainstream society. They had jobs in the civil service. They were military leaders. They were politicians. So basically, they were integrated into the society. But then in the 1960s, when military dictatorship took over, that's when the first seeds of racism began to be planted. Military leaders primarily, and the military itself, of course, primarily is Burmese. And the Burmese make up close to 80% of the ethnic makeup of Burma. Over the next 20 years, there was a process of slowly withdrawing certain rights. and targeting the Rohingya and demonizing them. And then finally in 1982, if I remember correctly, the Burmese National Assembly, and it was still under military dictatorship at the time, passed a law that stripped the Rohingya of their citizenship, which essentially stripped them of their rights. And that's when the seeds of the modern, like the major developments that led up to the atrocities began. Because once they were stripped of their rights, they no longer had the right to get jobs in government. They couldn't serve in the military. Whatever Rohingya politicians there were, they were basically removed over time. The educated leaders of the Rohingya community who were still there, they were, imprisoned, some dying in jail, and those who weren't imprisoned, many of them fled. So over the course of 40 years, basically the educated leadership of the Rohingya disappeared. The ones who did leave, managed and still managed to maintain their status as some sort of leader. Eventually, they got old and they died. And so what you have is a people who do not have, over the last 40 years, a leadership in any extensive way that could have set up, for example, a resistance in exile. And it's only been probably over the last 15, 20 years that you've had a concerted effort.
Just going back to before the plight of the Rohingya was known around the world, Aung San Suu Kyi had this international reputation for being a champion of human rights and democracy. A lot of people will be familiar with her story. She won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1991 for her resistance to the military dictatorship that held her under house arrest for 15 years.
It had made me real once again. The Nobel Prize had drawn the attention of the world to the struggle for democracy and human rights in Burma. We were not going to be forgotten.
Was it known at the time that she was a Buddhist nationalist?
Well, she's Buddhist, and that was well known. The fact that she was an ethno-nationalist, no, because she hit it very well. Because if all those international human rights activists and advocates had been aware that her commitment to democracy only included people who were ethnic Burmese or only Buddhists, then I'm sure they would have rethought what they were going to do. She played the international community who came to her aid very well. I think she's a very cold, calculating woman. And I think that was evident when she made her statement at the ICJ hearing, yesterday.
Regrettably, the Gambia has placed before the court an incomplete and misleading factual picture of the situation in Rakhine State in Myanmar.
I want to talk about that in detail, but before we get to her statement, this week, the Gambia, which is this tiny West African country, brought this case to the ICJ accusing Myanmar of genocide with the goal of getting an order from the court for emergency protections for the Rohingya that are still living in the country. And the UN says that these people are the targets of an ongoing genocide. The global community has come to describe this whole situation as ethnic cleansing, as genocide. But why is it that Gambia is the country that decided to bring forward these charges?
That's a very good question because this is a case that could have been brought by any signatory, any state party to the Genocide Convention. We had been asking Canada to do that as a state party to the Genocide Convention because Canada was the first country to officially recognize this as genocide. But the fact that that Gambia came forth, this tiny country, is great because they actually live up to their signature on the Genocide Convention. And when asked about why are you doing this, one of the responses that Gambian officials gave was that because we are a state party to the Genocide Convention, we believe in that treaty, and this is an egregious violation of that treaty, and someone has to step up. And we decided that we were going to do it.
Wow. So the Gambia is relying on witnesses, human rights experts, along with reporting from a UN fact-finding mission. Can you tell me briefly about the case that they've laid out in court? What are they accusing Myanmar of?
What they're asking for right now is provisional measures to stop what's happening right now, which is a still ongoing genocide against the Rohingya remaining in Myanmar. So this is not the full case. This is just the opening salvo. The basics that have been laid out is that Myanmar has violated at least 4 of the 5 criteria that constitute genocide under the Genocide Convention.
Every day of inaction means that more people are being killed, more women are being ravaged, and more children are being burnt alive. For what crime? Only because they were born different. Born of a different race and to a different religion from those who killed and raped them, to the Rohingya.
And of course, we've seen in media reports since 2017 what testimonials from witnesses and survivors.
The military entered our house and detained us with my 4 children and mother. They snatched all of our gold jewelry from us. 2 of them held me down while one of them raped me.
You know, basically killing women and children, you know, burning children and throwing children into burning homes, totally destroying villages, gang rapes of women.
The stories of violence against the Rohingya that have come out of Myanmar are hard to process. Just as an example, one woman told Al Jazeera in 2017 that soldiers ripped her baby out of her arms and then threw him into a fire. Then they gang raped her. Her parents, 2 of her sisters, and her younger brother were also killed. And this is just one of many, many atrocities that the Rohingya say they've suffered at the hands of Myanmar's military.
These acts include extrajudicial killings, physical and mental abuse, rape and other forms of sexual abuse, the destruction of homes and villages, forced starvation, denial of access to medical treatment and humanitarian assistance, and restrictions on movement. In our respectful submission, your order must explicitly set out acts of a genocidal nature which are to be avoided and prohibited.
While these, as I said, are the most egregious acts, the process of genocide, in the case of the criteria under Article 2, you only need to commit one of those acts in order for the act to be considered a genocide.
I know hundreds of thousands have fled to Bangladesh, thousands have been killed. Talk about what's been the overall impact on the Rohingya population.
Well, in the case of the Rohingya who fled, they fled to neighboring Bangladesh, an impoverished country, almost 200 million people with limited means. But bless their hearts, Bangladesh has taken them in, although now there is some tension happening in Bangladesh. The largest refugee camp in the world is situated in Bangladesh now, in and around Cox's Bazar. It's more than 1.2 million people. They are living in very precarious conditions.
Mostly women and children have fled from makeshift camps in Bangladesh, which some international observers say is a crisis of its own.
The combination of this weather and dirty water and lack of food and lack of a safe place to shelter is going to bring about a humanitarian disaster.
Unfortunately, one of the things that Bangladesh has done, which is very troubling, is that they're not allowing the Rohingya to get an education. You know, there's a political narrative in Bangladesh which says if we allow them to get an education and learn our language, then we'll never get rid of them. And so you've got a very precarious situation for the Rohingya in these camps. You've got serious health situations, not just from any injuries that they may have suffered when they were escaping Myanmar, but also from the conditions that they're living in. The camps itself is prone to serious flooding during monsoon season. So those Rohingya in Bangladesh are, you know, they see what's happening at the ICJ as the first chance of hope that they could possibly return. And the thing is, the vast majority of them don't want to end up going to some other part of the world. The vast majority, when you talk to them, they want to go home. They want to go back to, you know, the lives that they knew.
So as Gambia's lawyers were speaking, what was Aung San Suu Kyi's reaction as she was listening to them sort of lay out the atrocities that Myanmar is accused of committing?
When the camera turned to Aung San Suu Kyi, she was basically stone-faced, looking straight ahead, absolutely no reaction. This is a woman who has no compassion, no sympathy, no empathy, and clearly does not want to acknowledge that what has happened is the most heinous crime that can be committed under international law. I don't think that, just based on what, not only her response to the initial statement by Gambia, but then what she said, I don't think that, she's someone who really cares.
Right. The speech was about 30 minutes long, and what did she say?
Well, basically her statement was that the charge of genocide is wrong, that the charge should not happen under the Genocide Convention, that this case basically doesn't understand the situation in Myanmar, that the ethnic tensions, the fact that, we're fighting a terrorist war.
The Nobel Peace Prize laureate, once feted by the West as an icon of democracy, spoke for about 30 minutes, saying that a military-led clearance operation in Rakhine State was a legitimate counter-terrorism response to Rohingya militant attacks against dozens of police stations. Rights groups said Suu Kyi's statement contradicted evidence on the ground and witness accounts.
And all of this is laughable. It is totally laughable. These are statements that have been discredited again and again and again.
Myanmar has a military justice system. Criminal cases against soldiers or officers for possible war crimes committed in Rakhine must be investigated and prosecuted by that system. We are, however, dealing with an internal armed conflict. If war crimes have been committed by members of Myanmar's defense services, they will be prosecuted through our military justice system.
So she's not playing to the court. She's actually playing to an audience back in Myanmar.
Yeah.
She's facing an election. Everything that she said, it has no, as far as I can tell, it doesn't really have any basis in the legal procedures that you follow in order to present a case at the ICJ. It was more a political statement than it was a legal statement.
Is that your read on why she decided to do this in the first place, decided to go to The Hague and lead this defense? Because it didn't have to be her, right?
No, it didn't. In fact, usually in these sorts of things, you get, lawyers and, people from your justice ministry or justice department to go and lead the case. And maybe you have your foreign affairs minister there just as a token representative, but even the foreign affairs minister doesn't speak at these sorts of things because the process before the ICJ is a legal process, and the best person to represent you when you're, dealing with a legal case is a lawyer who understands the rules and who understands the law. And so, for her to do this, it was purely a political act. She didn't have to do this. In one way, I'm glad, I think, all the people who are, advocating on behalf of the Rohingya are happy that she did because it suddenly raised the issue again in the international arena, about what's going on. So that's the one positive thing that's come out of it. But I think in the long term, what it has shown is that she has gone from being this human rights icon to being someone who is complicit in genocide and is a defender of genocide. And that will be her legacy now. Inside Myanmar, people generally support her position on this. Oh, yeah, the vast majority do. They've been fed this narrative of Rohingya being subhuman and being cockroaches and being not worthy for living for decades.
Why we're supporting her is because here in our country, we don't have those kinds of genocide cases. That was actually civil war.
One criticism that I saw of her statement was that she didn't use the word Rohingya once, and people say that this is all part of Myanmar's attempt to strip the Rohingya of their identity, of their rights. What do you think of that? Oh, absolutely. Denying the identity of a targeted group and not using the word that they use to describe themselves is a classic, it's a soft form, but it is a classic aspect of genocide. Because if you deny them their identity, and you don't use the word that they use to describe themselves, then in the public narrative, you basically say they don't exist.
This is the first stage of hearings where the Gambia is asking the World Court to impose urgent measures and accountability in the short term to protect the Rohingya people before the entire case can be decided. The case to determine whether they're victims of genocide, and that could take years and years.
Is the ICJ the only and best way for the Rohingya to get protection?
It's the best way because it is a state-to-state process, and basically any decisions by the ICJ are binding on the states. If the ICJ court, the judges decide that certain measures need to be taken, whether it's provisional measures now or whatever happens at the end of the process, it means that there's a process that allows for restitution for the victims. They can say, well, that the Myanmar committed, it's clear Myanmar committed genocide against the Rohingya, and Myanmar has to pay restitutions and reparations to the Rohingya survivors because they have deprived them of their lives, the lives of their families, and their livelihoods and their property. So that's one of the advantages of using the ICJ.
What is the situation of the Rohingya who are still trapped in Myanmar right now? Just give people a sense of why these protection measures are so urgently needed.
There's, somewhere in the neighborhood of 500,000 plus Rohingya still remaining in Myanmar. About 150,000 of them are literally prisoners in what can only be termed as concentration camps, where every aspect of their life is controlled, how much food they get, who they can marry, whether or not they can have children. The Rohingya who aren't in these concentration camps live in very precarious situations where, their communities are surrounded by military forces. They are not allowed to work. Food, when they can get it, is rationed. So they're literally being starved to death. People are still being picked up and, tossed in jail on a whim. You still have situations of people being killed, but we're not getting the news anymore because there's no more people coming out. Pretty much the border has been sealed and no one has been allowed to go in from the outside world into Rakhine State where the Rohingya live. So they are still facing the same thing that the Rohingya who fled faced.
Any final thoughts?
Canada could have been the leader on this. Canada reacted very quickly when we started hearing about the atrocities. Canada investigated it, appointed a special envoy to investigate the situation. Bob Rae issued a report. And then, Canada committed $300 million in humanitarian aid, brought the issue up at international forums like the G7, and then we passed 2 resolutions where we became the first country to officially recognize that what was happening to the Rohingya was genocide. And then after that, nothing. And we started asking the Canadian government to file a case at the International Court of Justice under the Genocide Convention in early 2018. And Canada didn't. And we find this very troubling because if you're not willing to stand up and defend the foundational document of the United Nations, which is the Genocide Convention, the first treaty adopted by the United Nations, if you're not willing to defend that, then what are you really about?
So Canada has put out a statement with the Netherlands saying that they support the Gambia case.
There's nothing behind that. Those are words. They're great words. Great, let's support them. But how are we going to support them? There's no indication in the statement of whether that's going to mean that Canada's going to, support it financially or it's going to provide legal expertise or what it's going to do. So, once again, it's one of these statements where great words, but let's see the actions behind them. Frankly, I said this on Tuesday in my media conference. Words are cheap. Okay, it's easy to say things like that. It's when you put actions behind the words that you really make the difference.
Fareed, thank you so much for your time. Really, really appreciate it.